Hello, everybody. I'm Lucas Feldsman. I'm an affiliated scholar at the Bill Lane Center for the American West here at Stanford University, and I would like to welcome everybody to Fieldworks. This is a series of artist talks organized by the ArtsWest initiative and hosted by the Bill Lane Center. Today we have two fabulous artists joining today. I'm very excited. Dionne Lee. Hello, Dionne.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also Cleo McKenna. Hi, Cleo.
Hi, thank you.
So before we begin, I just would briefly like to acknowledge Stephanie Burbank and Marco Martinez, who helped organize and run these events. Also, really special thanks to Bruce Kane, the director of the center, and to David Kennedy as well, who was a co-founder of the center. I personally would like to acknowledge the Guggenheim Foundation for supporting my work with a fellowship, and the Bill Lane Center for inviting me to participate in this illustrious community of artists. If you are not familiar with the work conducted here, please go to the website west.stanford.edu, and you will find a plethora of information about events and research conducted at the center. Not only is there research done here about important environmental issues like wildfire management, water of the West, and historical issues, there is also much important research done about Western governance and policy implementation. Let's say there is a new law on pollution being implemented. What are the effects on the ground? How come it might be more successful in Los Angeles County than in Fresno County, and so on. So this is another really important work that is being done here. And by the way, the West is defined here at the center as extending west from the 100th meridian, and that includes Western Canada, all of Mexico, and extends into the Pacific. The center is a loosely affiliated group of researchers, scientists, and teachers working together to make this place a better place for the benefit of us all and for generations to come. And then ArtsWest is a section of the center focusing on arts and culture and presents artists and their vision to illuminate a different way of understanding who we are and how we are shaped by our relationship to the land. The working process of artists is very different from scientists and does not follow a rigorous protocol, but kind of reinvents itself constantly. Thus, I like to present today another kind of fieldwork. And our first speaker is Dionne Lee. She was born in New York City in 1988 and now lives in Oakland and teaches at the photography at the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford. Her work has been shown, among other places, at MoMA, New York, as part of the New Photography series. The work extends from photography to video and collage. And what I find really intriguing is that although it looks very new and contemporary, there is a link, an inspiration, maybe just a nod to landscape photography of the past. I almost want to say Timothy of Sullivan and the geological surveys, or maybe Carlton Watkins. But in any case, there is a reference to history, but yet the work is grounded deeply in a felt relationship to the landscape. Please welcome Dionne Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for that awesome introduction. So happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm also gonna timer set so I stay on track here. So, okay, so let me know if y'all can see a video here. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, cool, thank you. So yeah, in my work, I'm interested in ideas around survival, ancestral trauma, and resilience as it relates to my relationship to the American landscape. And for me, like you mentioned some great landscape photographers, Lucas. For me, I am definitely like working within this canon of landscape photography, but I'm actually less interested in the view that was often that's been like prioritized through photographic history, and that's particularly that view of a kind of distant, like wide angle view of a like barren, empty kind of landscape that's kind of you know, attached to ideas around manifest destiny, if you and like ideas around untouched land, right? And so unlike someone like Carlton Watkins or somebody like that, I am actually really interested in being close to the ground, is what I like to say. And so that means that, you know, while I am working with the landscape photography, I'm not making those types of like broad sweeping images. But this video is me, it's called Challenger Deep, and it's a video of me traversing some landscape looking for groundwater. What I'm holding is called or water dowsing rods, also called water witching, and it's like a technique sometimes regarded as a pseudoscience almost, but actually used by like architects and other folks. But it's a way to detect groundwater. And what you would do is you would have to like psychically charge these rods to communicate to you that there's water underground. And so I decided to try to do this. And my interest in survival really is rooted in me actually like engaging in these practices myself. And this is this video in particular I find kind of a little bit funny, because if there was, this is considered a survival skill, like knowing how to do this. And I think to myself, if there was a true emergency, like would I really have the wits about me to like psychically charge something to then like communicate to me to like dig for water? But I am interested in this kind of like relationship between like having faith in something unknowable tied with some sort of like practical knowledge, which I think those two together kind of really make up like partially what it means to be able to survive. I also made this video, you know, shortly after moving to California, and we were in the height of a historic drought, and obviously also just thinking about the fact that our oceans are rising, and there was something about that simultaneous like drying up beneath the ground and the ocean rising to meet us happening at the same time, which I also found interesting. But to move on, I did just want to kind of take a step back for a second and just talk about the fact that I am from New York City. I actually grew up in Harlem, right across the street from Central Park. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I learned that part of Central Park was once occupied by this community of Black property owners. And that community was called Seneca Village. And before that, the Lenape people were stewards of all of what we know as today and as New York City and the greater tri-state area. But this image that we're looking at now was once believed to be the remnants of Seneca Village, and it turns out that it's not. It's actually just like a sandbox from like 1930s, and whatever is left behind from Seneca Village is actually far beneath what the surface of what we see here. But I like to talk about this because really, for me, my work and research really sits within thinking about the relationship between people and land, specifically the relationship between Black people in the American landscape. And I'm also interested in like what we think we know or understand, or even like the information we have access to, similar to just like I grew up across the street from, you know, Central Park as my front yard, but had no idea of this like larger history behind the space. And to fast forward then, so like, you know, I was already kind of like had a little bit of a moment of reflection thinking about my relationship to place. But when I moved to California from New York City, there was this really, I went through this really, I don't want to call it culture shock, but there was some sort of just transition that happened from moving somewhere from like New York City that's really dense. I had never really seen like large swaths of sky before I moved to California. Like that was interesting to me. Even being able to see like the horizon line really frequently was something else that was just a new experience for me. And that again really started to have me really caused me to rethink my relationship to place. For this image, I made my first year moving to California, and I actually had gotten one of those earthquake survival kits because I was super afraid of earthquakes. And in those kits, they have those, emergency blankets with like reflective sheets that are often used in situations of crisis. It can be used as an insulator to keep you warm, or as like a reflective, like signaling. But I had this idea that when I was interested in the material, and I was also doing research around like the Reconstruction era during this country, like post-Civil War, and thinking a lot about the promise of 40 acres and a mule that the government was, um, supposed to offer to freed people as like reparation, but that never happened, as we know. But I had this idea when I was looking at this blanket to try and make a 40-acre emergency blanket. And returning to like my, kind of silly city kid self, I actually didn't know how big 40 acres was when I decided to do this. And I just like started working away and piecing these blankets together. And as it got larger and larger, I decided then to check and like, how big is 40 acres? I actually don't know. And it turns out I was like, okay, this isn't going to happen. Like, I can't do this by myself. But there was something about like my inability to understand that felt bigger and more profound than like even just like trying to accomplish building that out. Just like, again, about the information that I knew, like growing up in a city, I don't measure things in acreage, right? But then it also spoke to the difficulties of how to like survey or capture such a massive loss, right? Not just a massive amount of space, but a massive um, failure actually of our country. Um, and yeah, it's something about like my failure to actually be able to build this out just really, I realized that that's where the work was for me. And it still stands as like more of a proposition, right? It's a test for 40 acres. And just for like some reference, in today's dollar, 40 acres and a mule for every freed person at that time would be the equivalent of $6.4 trillion today. So again, like scale. And when I think about loss, I also try and think about like how to repair. So um, something that's important to me is how to repair. I mean, it's more like thinking about this this space between like damage to the land versus like reparation towards the land. So in this particular image, I'm thinking a lot about this gesture that I'm hoping is like ambiguous as to whether this image is going through some sort of repair or removal, whether I'm like opening or closing this portal at the center. And I'm thinking about the resiliency of land and the events that happen on land that threaten other people and the damage done to it by humans and our own wills to like repair that damage. And I will just say this particular image, I use a lot of found imagery in my work, and this is from a nature book that was published in 1964. And that year is always important to me to just consider my practice because it's not only the year the Civil Rights Act was passed, but also the Wilderness Protection Act. And I just think there's some sort of interesting like kinship that exists in those two things happening at the same time. And then I'm only playing parts of these videos, obviously, because it's short on time, but this video is called Drafts, and was an experiment in like collage and play, but it really came out of this desire to want to reckon with my feelings about like traditional landscape photography. So I had a copy of this book called The World We Live In that was filled with these like really scenic views of America, and I was interested in challenging the authorship of these images, considering who historically took pictures like this and why, and just wanting to disrupt that. And so I did that literally through playing with the material itself and kind of what I call it intuitive collaging here. I'll let it play just for a little bit and then I'm gonna move on. Sorry to go so short here, but so moving, just jumping to more present times. I my interest in wilderness and like survival in nature was really focused on green spaces, and I was interested in challenging my own like expectations of what counts as wilderness. And so I became really interested. I'm sorry if you can hear this music inside of my house right now. I was interested in thinking about water as a wilderness space, oceans, open bodies of water, and really understanding that to be a political space that's just as political as like nature, so open nature, as when it comes to Black people relating to these spaces. And for me, a symbol of that is the sail. And the sail to me serves as this like complex symbol that came after I had an experience sailing with a friend. But you know, this, you think of sailing, it kind of evokes this idea of like the freedom of travel, excitement of exploration, but it doesn't really address the like wickedness that can come under the guise of exploration, such as like genocide of Native people or the transatlantic slave trade. And so I also am often thinking about ancestral trauma too, and thinking, you know, in my own experiences, like when I was a child, I had a near drowning experience at a friend's pool party, and I didn't know how to swim. I wandered into the deep end, and my friend, and there was a lifeguard there who didn't like do anything, and my friend at the whose party was had to come in and get me out. We were both like 10 or 11 at the time. And you know, that was a kind of a moment for me, although I was young, of realizing my discomfort in certain spaces. And I often think back to ancestral trauma and think, well, like, how does that live in the body? How does it, when my ancestors, you know, were brought to this country across rough waters on a ship, or then were kept out of public pools, you know, like how does that now, how does that move through generations, right? Like, how does that trauma show up? And yeah. Um, on the flip side of that, it's also like, you know, swimming, survival skill, of course, right? But on the flip side of that, like more recently, I started to really dig into looking like at wilderness survival guides and manuals. And I began sourcing a lot of material from those spaces, from those books. And the first thing that you'll see in all of those books is kind of like how to build a shelter, right? Your most basic, one of the first things you need, right, to protect yourself. And in the center here, this is an image of that shelter. It's called a lean-to shelter. But for me, what was always interesting about it is that it actually looks like a trap to me. Like, I feel like I can kick this like little stick over and the whole thing will collapse, and like you like couldn't like get out. And so there's this like duality and symbolism that exists in a lot of the images in these like survival guides. And I will also just say that the phrase that what's written, the text on this is, it says together on the ground to form the base, which is also the title of this piece. And that those words together, they're pulled from this survival book, from the instructions actually on how to build a shelter. But it really became a guide for me to think about how history piles up. When you remember that like the earth is a living thing that has memory and becomes a witness, right? Like history is literally on the ground beneath our feet. And I'm gonna just scroll through images as I talk a little bit more about these things. But I also was interested in survival skills because, you know, I worry about climate change, and I was like, do I need to like know how to become a prepper? Kind of in like in a half joking but half serious of just like, how do I ensure that I am prepared for like whatever may come? And obviously, a lot of this work too was made pre-pandemic, but I was also a part of the survival skills that I learned was how to map the sky at night. And this is an image of me demonstrating like how you would find the North Star if you were to try and, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you should be able to like hold your hands just like this. This measures 15 degrees and another 15 is 30. And this pinky would be at the edge of the end of the Big Dipper handle. And then the North Star should be there. And pretty much anyone, hands, and like if you're in a Northern Hemisphere with decent eyesight, you should be able to do this. And this was a moment in my practice that really shifted my research, where I was really looking to like historical events and not so much thinking about my own personal experiences, but the research was living outside of myself. And this is when it started to actually like show up in my body, because something about doing this and thinking, it functions almost like as a portal for me as well, similar to the piece with the pink flowers, and just thinking about like, oh, did an ancestor of mine hold their bodies in the same position? And obviously, like the North Star, right? We have all of these aspirational associations with it, right? It's the direction of freedom, right? Especially for folks fleeing the South during for enslavement. It's an aspirational direction. But in my like practice of this, then I took this class to learn how to do all that stuff. And then I got back home and I did some more research, and I learned that there are actually two norths. There's magnetic north and then there's true north. And magnetic north is what your compass responds to, and true north is about 500 miles away from that. And something about that, like there being two, was really felt kind of like a, no, it was, it it for me like reflected that these like aspirations or these sense of like freedom is actually a moving target, and there's no real like resting spot for those. But also remembering the like power of like how your body can be its own. So, and so I will keep scrolling, and I just wanted to address, I know part of this talk was supposed to address kind of like working during COVID times. And like I said, like I was making this work before the pandemic happened. Like that was actually not like I was thinking about these sorts of like emergency situations that could come up that I have to be prepared for, but I was definitely not thinking about something like a pandemic. And so um, it was a really difficult time to be like thinking about this for a few years, and then all of a sudden it's like an event actually happens that can actually threaten and has brought up issues of survival for many, like collectively across the whole world. So this is a piece I made at the beginning of 2020, the first thing, like soon after I cleared out my locker at Stanford and just took all my stuff home. And it was again a kind of moment of dropping back into like the body, because as I'm making this, um, I was living near downtown Oakland. There's protests happening outside of my window. There's helicopters flying around on top of the pandemic. And it was just a really, I don't have a lot to say about making during COVID because it's really hard. It's still really hard. But I will say that like stylistically, I noticed that my work became way more, there was an urgency to how I was treating the materials. And a and then the wildfires came too as well. So it was just like, as we all know, living here, right? It was just everything was starting to compound onto each other. Um, but fire is also something that I think about a lot. Um, these two images are hands building a fire, which is I took a fire making class as I was studying these skills, and um, I really see it as, again, a great example of like dueling um, forces existing within one entity, where, as we know here in California, right, fire has great potential to be dangerous and destroy lives. But in the back of my mind, I also was thinking about how fire has been used as a tool to like, for land use, right? Or for like replenishing soil. And I, this is my last slide. I was just interested in that duality. And in this particular image, I'm just acting out the first step for building a fire, which is just like clearing your leaves, your debris from the space in which you want to start your fire so nothing else catches flame. And this step for me also called back to that phrase, together on the ground to form the base, just thinking about like the act of clearing leaves as a way of like making space, right, for if you're making space to build a fire, right, you're making space to provide something for yourself to ensure your survival so you can be warm, so you can cook your food. But I also was thinking like, well, what does it mean to actually make the space like through in history, right? And just like, if it's all on the ground, how can you clear that space for replenishing, right? Or sometimes it's also like, how much of it do we need to like burn down just to like start over again? But I'll end there. This is my last slide. I could say more, but I want to keep time well. So I'll hand it over to Clea. But if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dion. We'll take some questions after both speakers have spoken. And if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And I also wanted to mention that if you need captions, the captions are available and you can have those going. Our next speaker is Cleo McKenna, and she was born in Freestone, California in 1980 and now lives and works in San Francisco. Cleo works with photographic materials and also writes and makes films. And her piece, No Feeling is Final, is currently on view at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art as part of the exhibition Close to Home, Creativity in Crisis. It's a fantastic piece. Please go see it. There's nothing like seeing real art in a real space, and it is open through December of this year. Almost every image from the history of photography has passed through a tiny hole, the eye of a needle, or the aperture as we know it. This bundling of light with a lens and the mechanics of the camera is responsible for the look, feel, and ultimately the meaning of most photographic images produced. Cleo McKenna has done away with photographic projections and has instead embraced touch and transparency. The resulting images directly connect the materiality of the physical world with the emotional state of the viewer. Please welcome Cleo McKenna.
Thank you, Lucas. That was a lovely introduction. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I am gonna share my screen. And yep, do it. Okay. Try to find the thing. Okay. And I have way too many slides, so I am gonna just kind of breeze through them, and I'm not gonna talk about like the technique of every single project. I'm just gonna, just kind of let them wash over you. And Lucas had asked that we consider the idea of field work for this talk. And so last minute this morning, I decided, you know what, instead of like the usual artist talk, I think I'll just try to find the fieldwork thread through several projects, because it is something, it's actually something that I was very tuned into and focused on about a decade ago, and then I've sort of let it slide, but it's still there. And so it was really interesting for me to go back and kind of look through my work and go, oh yeah, that thread is still coming up actually. Yeah, so this is just a photo of my brother and I when we were kids, and it's just a little clue to where I'm coming from. Very different than Dion, which I love. I grew up in Northern California and Hawaii, but my early childhood was spent largely off the grid in Hawaii, living like in a one-room house with no electricity and using a lot of those skills. So that influences, and obviously this photo is kind of a joke. We were dressed up, but this was kind of, you know, we did live in the forest, and we played this way a lot. So I'm going back first to some work that I made about 12 or 13 years ago, I think, right after graduate school. And I was thinking actively at the time about fieldwork. My parents were both ethnobotanists, so I had grown up around ideas of fieldwork, both in terms of the natural sciences and also ethnography and anthropology. And I was in a phase in my art practice where I had just recently let go of like the camera and the lens and had moved into cameraless photography almost exclusively. But the question I had was sort of, if I take the methodology of, field biologists, let's say, for example, or those kinds of natural scientists who have a practice of field work and of observation, and I apply that level of focus and deep observation and patience and returning to the same location and those kinds of qualities, but to an end that's not scientific, like what will I witness instead? And I was also interested in identifying other people who kind of do that. So what other maybe professions or people inadvertently participate in that level of like deep observation of landscape. And this was an interesting kind of case study. This piece was made out at the, in the Marin Headlands at one of those old, cement structures that was actually a anti-aircraft lookout post. So soldiers were stationed there in World War II to watch the horizon for enemy planes. And they were stationed on 12-hour shifts, like, dawn till dark, switch, whatnot. And, for years. And so they were looking for planes, but instead they were observing, sunsets and the light changing on the water and this kind of atmospheric change that we all know when you look at the sky over the ocean, right? And I loved that. And I just loved the idea of that, finding that depth of observation and translating it. So then, as I often work, as Lucas said, I use light sensitive materials, but I use them in ways that weren't how they were intended. So what these were was, I'll go back to this one. It was 12 hours from dawn till dark of folding paper airplanes in the dark, folding photo paper into paper airplanes and then exposing them to light at that spot, to the light of the sky and the horizon. And it became this installation. So it was sort of just an interpretation of that period of time there. And you can see the architectural structure of the planes is kind of evident in the images as well. This is other work that I was making around the same time. Also made on, that's another thing about my work at that time, was that it was all made on location. It wasn't made in the studio. So it did have this kind of field work feeling to it. I needed always to be in like specific locations under specific weather, light conditions. So there was a lot of planning, transit, and then waiting for the perfect conditions. And sometimes in that waiting period, something else would happen, or I would discover something else I wanted to make work with, but that waiting period was generative. And I imagine that that's often true in various forms of field work. It's kind of where the meat is sometimes. So this was work made in Hawaii on the land that I had grown up on. I started going back there, made outdoors at night, where I would, I'd go out during the day and kind of collect things in the landscape, bring them back to my little field station, and then wait for it to get dark, and then make these large kind of haphazard photograms. This is my toolkit on the bottom of my very, very crude ingredients. I always call my materials ingredients for some reason. And they are always the simplest possible form of what I need. I'm not high tech and I don't like gear. So yeah, this is that work several years later when I showed it much more recently with my two kids on me. So the kids also really affected my ability later, a few years after the work I was just showing, when I started having kids, that really changed my ability to work in that kind of field work way. and in that way of going to weird locations in the middle of the night and kind of using the world as my dark room became less possible. So this is work that I started making around like maybe 2012, and I think it was the first work that I feel really clear and strongly about it doing the thing I was looking to do, which was to visually represent this kind of attention and presence to detail in the landscape. So these are photograms, black and white, gelatin silver photograms of rain made at night outdoors in the rain. And they range in size from about 20 by 24 to about like 30 by 40. So as you can see, there's one, and then there's a detail close up on the right. Just looking at my notes to see if I'm forgetting whole categories of thought here. Yeah, okay, so so this was a little bit of like a breakthrough to me in a couple of ways, in that it pointed out to me how much detail it's possible to capture via this very crude technique of cameraless photography and of just light and paper, essentially. And how much like articulation there is, because a lot of experimental photography has the kind of appearance of sort of like a mistake, or it's kind of like loose in this way that is not very satisfying to me. I think that's a great entry point, and it's a great experiment with your materials and a way to get to know them, but that can't be like the end point for me. And I simultaneously have like moved in this direction away from straight photography because I wanted to lose control over the process. But then I also, after some years of increasingly losing control, I also wanted to regain my voice and my like articulation in it. And I kind of love like crystalline detail, because that's a lot of how I experienced the landscape. I loved what Dion said about close to the ground. Is that what you said? Close to the ground? Because that's kind of exactly how I feel, and the way I relate to landscape is less this like big expansive view and more almost like physiological tactile experience of the minutia of it. Yeah, so that's what these are. There's another one, the different forms just result from different angles. And then this, at the end of this project, here, I'll let this run while I talk. At the end of this project, which I worked on for several years, I was making these rain studies, and then I was really tired of making them, and everybody kept wanting me to make more of them, and I was done. And so I took all the images I had made, digital images of the photograms, and made them into this animation, which it's a couple hundred photograms, I think, that are in it. So this was sort of an afterthought, but it was a way to find like closure on this project and to be able to see all the detail, but also more importantly in this form, all the kind of rhythm and repetition, which is what you feel when you're in the rain. And for me, like misusing these materials, which is what I like to do, right, is kind of a sort of like a synesthesia. It's like, can we, like in this case, as an example, can we represent a sensation that we're all familiar with, but represent it in a different way, right? So when I say standing in the rain, standing in the pouring rain in the dark, you guys all have a feeling in your mind maybe of what that feels like to you, but it's not a visual sense. It's maybe you hear the sound of it or you feel it on your skin. And so then translating it into a visual form is this kind of like, it's not exactly a misuse, I'm not sure of the word, but it's kind of this mistranslation, and also a mistranslation with the medium. And I, for whatever reason, that is how I like to work. And I find that when I do that, something new comes out of the space in between. So as I mentioned before, in field work, there's a lot of waiting, and this work was a product of that waiting. So in making the rain work, this was in Hawaii. I was taking a lot of trips back to this family land during that time. And you know, I'd get all my gear set up and everything ready, and then I'd wait for it to rain and I'd wait for it to get dark. And at dusk, during that time, is when the spiders come out and weave their webs, the orb weavers. And so that was something I would observe every night while I was waiting. And then I'd do my work and whatnot late. And you have to wait till it's really quite late for the darkness to be like dark enough. And then I'd go to bed, and there's no bathroom in the house. So then around 4 a.m., I'd always come out to go pee outside, and the webs, these huge, I mean, these are very large detailed webs, they'd be gone by 4 a.m. And I was always like, what is going on here? So yeah, I looked it up and discovered that the orb weavers actually swallow their own web if they don't catch enough protein, because they like, you know, the web is made of protein. And so if they don't catch enough bugs that night, they'll swallow their web, remake it the next night, recycle that protein in their body, which I just think is beautiful. So then I began making these photograms of the webs with the rain caught in them. That's a detail on the left. And always, always with this work, and really with all my work, I'm looking for like ruptures in the pattern. So I love the idea with these webs, and then you'll see with later work with trees, I love the idea that there's an inborn kind of pattern that the spider knows how to build, and it wants to replicate the same shape again and again of concentric circles. And then, you know, but it inevitably fails, right? There's always an accident, or the things crisscross, or a bird or a bat or something messes it up. And to me, that's the best part. So I always kind of focus on those moments. I'm just realizing the resolution of that image is pretty bad. Okay, so that, let's see. Yeah, so then this was a big shift for me. This was the first new work I made after my daughter was born, my first kid. And I had gone through a big transition and a very rough year. And I had always had this question about like texture and rubbings, and kind of the idea of like the unphotographable, but then in relation to photograms, the unphotogrammable, right? So what is something that is like giant, opaque, immovable, immobile, you know? And so these are photograms. This was kind of my answer to that. It took a while to develop this technique, but these are rubbings where I hand emboss the black and white photo paper in darkness onto surfaces in the landscape. And then I take them and expose them to grazing light. And so it's actually just the texture and the pressure of my body that creates the image, which of course is a misuse of the paper, which is meant to work off of, you know, photograph is meant to work off of reflected light and projected light and whatnot. But this was kind of an exciting shift. And so this is just a rubbing of a crack in an old battery out at the Headlands. I had a studio out there at the time. And these are just some like studio shots of like working out the method. So again, this required a lot of kind of expeditions, you know, a lot of waiting till the moon was at the right phase, so there wasn't too much moonlight, going out at night, bundled up with assistants or an assistant, and, you know, we'd play music to keep the coyotes away, and yeah, rubbing the rocks on our hands and knees in the dark. Strange activity. Many people came and asked us what we were doing. This was an installation. This turned into several installations where I would make these rubbings that were 20 by 24 and then fit them together. This is applying that same technique to tree stumps. And I think like as time went on, my relationship to the idea of observation of nature, which had kind of been where I started, changed less into observing nature and more into kind of witnessing the scars and marks and textures and the kind of evidence of human interaction or of the organism itself, but kind of finding the ways in which you can witness the life of an object or the life of a place. You know, a tree, so like going back to that idea with the spider webs, a tree wants to grow in perfect concentric circles. That's kind of its blueprint. And everywhere that it diverges from that plan is where something happened to it. So either a flood or, you know, a drought, an infestation, human interaction, saw marks, or even with redwood trees like this, you know, they're very sensitive to space. If another tree or object grows very close to them, they kind of wiggle, and that's why redwood trees are so ripply. So it's in the kind of flaws and imperfections or breaks in the pattern where the story of the organism is. This one, you can see the chainsaw marks. There's a detail of those. And so around this time, my kind of field work became less about going out into the landscape and more about gathering materials out in the world and bringing them into the studio. And that was partly driven by what I mentioned about having kids, is that like I needed to be able to work during the hours that I had childcare. But it was also, I think, something I had long wanted, sort of, to be able to have more of a studio practice. And it actually involves its own form of field work, which is more having to do with people. So I, you know, in order to gather the materials I need, I have to develop these relationships with kind of fixers, right? In this case, I befriended several arborists and tree trimmers, and they would call me if they were cutting down something interesting and I could get a slab of it. Later, when I started collecting textiles and working with textiles, I, you know, befriended different dealers at the flea market and textile dealers on eBay. And so there's kind of this more human interaction that takes place in kind of culling materials from the world. This is another one of those, a cypress tree. And here's, I've tried to add in as many process shots as I could, because I know that's kind of what you can't see when you see the work in an exhibition. So these are kind of behind the scenes of working with the trees. And when it began, I was working with stumps that were still growing, you know, not growing, but were still embedded in the ground and on location. And as it went on, like I said, I started bringing slabs into my studio and into the darkroom, and it became a much more, the work became very physical. I mean, the work had been physical for a while, but it became very physical at this point. Yeah, you've got my daughter helping and different people who I work with. Oops, what happened? Oh, there, okay. They also got bigger. This one is a 4-panel one, so it's much larger. This is a 300-year-old incense cedar tree, and if I know what year the tree's cut down in, which I generally do, then I can count backwards from the rings and figure out, you know, when it was born. So these larger ones are all titled for the year the tree started growing. So this is born in 1717, which, you know, that interest in the kind of story of an organism being embedded in its own body through its like marks and flaws is really satisfying then to think about 300 years and what was this location like 300 years ago? You know, what was it like where this tree was cut down, which was up in like West Marin, Sonoma County, that area. The holes in this one are all from beetles eating, you know, the heart of it. And there you can get a sense of scale. It's wet from the darkroom still. So these are all just, you know, analog prints that I'm just one of a kind. They're not reproducible. The thing is the thing. And I'm hand processing them. When I work really large, I process everything vertically on the wall and paint the chemistry on and wash it off. This is another one of that cypress tree. Okay, I'm almost done. Well, I'm not, but I'm gonna go fast. Okay, I'm not gonna talk too specifically about this work. I'm just gonna show you some images because I wanna talk about the most recent stuff as well. So I shifted at that point into working more with material, objects from like material culture, human culture, but I was treating them much the same way. These ones are made the same technique, except the only shift is that instead of hand rubbing the paper, I wanted to work with materials with subjects that had a fluidity so that I could play more with composition. And so I began using a giant etching press. And so for these, I'm running the paper through the etching press with the textile in the dark, peeling them apart and then casting light across it. And then also adding a lot of toners afterwards. Again, there's some stuff for scale. And I'm really interested a lot in the same things with these, except obviously these textiles come with a huge amount of like cultural background. And I was very beholden to that. I wanted to foreground, their origins, who made them, why they made them, what they meant to the places they came from and those people. And so there was a lot of research involved in this body of work, both culling images, like, from the internet about kind of the history of these materials, as well as writing about them. That's working on toning one. There's a detail. And there's the finished piece. This is a La China Poblana, which is a type of traditional skirt from Mexico, but that actually has its origins in India from a Bengali woman who moved to Mexico, was taken as a slave to Mexico in the 1600s and then influenced the fashion there. So I won't go into it too much, but each of the pieces I chose to work with had a kind of cross-cultural background where there was influences of trade routes or of migration, and of course of labor, and in this case, almost entirely women's labor because the textile world is that way. So that was a big part of this as well. So the objects that I was collecting out in the world I was choosing intuitively, but then they were also coming with these huge histories, and that became like its own kind of path to study and explore. This one is nylons from the 1950s and 60s, American-made nylons. And so that research took the form first of an artist book that accompanied an exhibition in which there were essays about each piece and these images. And then later it became a mural that accompanied the next exhibition of this work. Kind of looking at the physical gesture and the commonalities in the gesture of sewing and making textiles across different cultures and practices. And it was those histories that I was researching that would then inform the final image that I made. I would choose patterns and shapes and ways to treat the material kind of based on both my personal relationship to those objects as well as, their origins. This was a bridal tunic that I could not find very much information on through research. And so I decided to actually dismantle all the seams and take it apart into its pieces and kind of see what one could understand about it through the physical object of it, which was really different than how I worked with the other ones. This led to this piece, which looks small here, but it's actually about 7 feet by 7 feet. And this was the work I made during the pandemic. It looks very different, but it's similar in the sense that I was relating to these objects as kind of surrogates for human experience. And I was collecting these objects. In this case, I was collecting them online because it was the pandemic. So I was, at home. So buying tons of handkerchiefs off of eBay and then making them using the handkerchiefs as negatives to make these prints, these photograms. This is what the finished installation looks like at SF MoMA. And the emulsion I use is not actual emulsion, it's ink. It's watercolor ink, which through researching a different project, I discovered that certain kinds of watercolor inks are very unstable, very fugitive. They fade in the sunlight very quickly, almost quick enough that it feels like a very slow photographic, material. And so I began making these at the beginning of the pandemic, and it just kind of snowballed and became more and more because, you know, my experience of the pandemic was really a parenting experience, which I think it's been a really different year for people who have kids versus people who don't. I see those things on the New York Times about like things to do at home, like as though you have a free minute at home. I have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so this was like my sanity was like, okay, it's time for mom to do this. You guys can be here, but I'm going to do this thing now. And my 6-year-old got quite involved. There she is. We expose them on my roof to sunlight, and they take weeks. Each exposure takes several weeks. And yeah, so she loves that part of it. This is the short version of this, but there's lots of info on this project out there now because it's in this show. And there's also a 10-minute video I just made that's kind of a self-documentation of this project that I think as of MoMA is gonna put out there in the next few days. So if you're interested in this, you can find out more about it. The handkerchiefs were dyed black. I dyed them black, which I thought of as developing my negatives because I did it for the practical reason of blocking more light. But then I realized it felt very much like a kind of mourning ritual, you know, dyeing your clothes black after someone dies and wearing black for a certain period of time. And so I really embraced that. And the handkerchiefs themselves became more and more kind of corporeal and bodily. And, you know, they would dye black, they would tear, some of them were already torn, then they fade in the sunlight. They would drift around my house endlessly because I had nowhere to put them. So there was always this kind of cloud of like small black objects floating around like a flock of crows or something. And eventually it became clear to me that they needed to become part of the installation itself and that it wasn't just about making the prints, that they were the thing. That's one of the first times, if you look at like the projects I just showed you, that's one of the first times that the subject actually became the object as well, which I think is kind of a shift in the fieldwork thing of like, I'm not just picturing it, it's now sculptural. I've done that once before, but that's kind of new to me, so I'm exploring that. And I'll just flip through a few of these. These are the prints, they're 11 by 14 each, and the installation has 140 of them in it. And I think for me, like working with the landscape and then in the last few years working with kind of material culture it's really not about the specific objects. It's about the way that humans wear and tear on objects, and therefore our stories get embedded in those. And that kind of goes back to the way I was brought up. Is one thing that I held on to was this idea of the inanimate world being animated or kind of charged. I mean, sort of like what Dion said about the divining rods, that you like psychically charge them, right? That's an intention. But I kind of feel that we do that all the time inadvertently by like charging, you know, the objects that are against our bodies, the things we touch and use every day. And there's a kind of energy that goes into those that then I'm sort of looking to draw out when I make work with these objects. And therefore the part I'm always highlighting is the imperfections and the flaws and the places where those stories kind of show up. So this is just a little teaser of the stuff I'm working on right now, which involves collecting old flea market, like oil paintings, and then kind of destroying and remaking them for my own means. So there's some of them, they're really hideous. And some of them are great though, but they're transforming a lot. And so that's kind of the current experiment. And there's my info. I post a lot of process stuff on Instagram. So kind of the behind the scenes of how the things are made is more evident there than anywhere else. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Really fantastic work. And let's just maybe go back to Dion first quickly. I have a question for you, Dion. The work made by men in relation to the natural is markedly different than from what women might do in the landscape. My friend Linda Connor calls it the pissing theory, which is that men want to control, conquer, or at least mark in the landscape, whereas women tend to more towards embracing and being part of the landscape. How do you see yourself within that tradition?
That's a good question. That's interesting. I mean, I definitely think, that it is just personally, like I do have like an intimate relationship to place and landscape. Like I'm interested in these like survival skills because that's just like naturally like I've studied herbalism. I like love foraging for plants and doing things like that. But in my work, I really think about what the problem of that is, which is like of what you're describing. You're saying that it's like a male way of interacting with the land. I think that that is true. I think it's also one that's really steeped in like whiteness as well and related to colonialism, and like that's really the angle from which I'm looking at it from, less so gendered but more so like motivations in terms of power. And so it makes sense when you think about like gendering that, like, yeah, that tends to align more with men. But I definitely think I'm also interested in like what yeah, just like interrogating that motivation for power and the consequences of that. So just like, to go back to when we're talking about early landscape photography, that's showing land that is occupied as being empty, right? That's like ready for the taking. So thinking about those sorts of consequences.
Mhm. Thank you.
Mhm.
Clea, you not only make visual arts in terms of prints and photograms, but you also make films and you write. How does one of these practices suddenly take over and kind of become important, or and demand all of your attention, or is there some kind of strategic approach to it? How does that work?
Yeah, nothing strategic.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, visual art and photographic media is definitely my primary way of communicating. Writing, I have a weird relationship to writing. I cannot do it on demand at all, but every once in a while, there's like a sudden flurry of it that I don't know where it comes from, and it just has to happen. And I have a long-term goal to like hone that a little more and be able to utilize it. I did write a lot during the pandemic, a lot more than I do normally. And that was partly, for obvious reasons. I even once I came back to my studio, I couldn't have my assistant working with me, so I couldn't make the really large prints. And so I was just kind of my creative energy was kind of splintering in different directions. The films, it's more like sometimes there's just something that has to be shown in a film, and I don't know how to show it another way. I mean, maybe Dionne feels similarly because she makes videos as well. Yeah, it really depends. I mean, I think that there is something really satisfying about writing and about saying something in a really clear way, because visual art is so inarticulate, in that like we put something out there, we can feel it says whatever we want, but there's so much room for interpretation, and of course there is with anything, but I do think there's a kind of clarity in writing that's something I admire when others can do it, and I'm interested in it. And I've just started kind of dabbling with sharing it. I've always written, but I just haven't shared it that much, so I've started sharing it a little more.
Great. Here's a question from Peter Blank. For all three photographers, your practices vary considerably, yet you all have devised favorite means to present your work. Could you talk a bit about how each of you presents your work, approach to presentation, and why the method hanging books and sequencing books, video editing works for you?
Mhm. I can answer that. Hi, Peter. Miss you. Haven't seen. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Something I didn't really mention, although it was under there was text. It was like under the descriptor of the images. That all my work is pretty small. Like they're all under. I think the largest I go is 16 by 20. And that kind of folds back into thinking about this idea of like being close to the ground or not wanting to kind of show like a grandiose view of places. And another part is that all my work even though I'm using found imagery, they get scanned and turned into a silver gelatin print for collaging. So that's another important act that I do in terms of, again, thinking about authorship and reauthoring and what it means to then like turn this, you know, thing from a book that I just like cut out into this like archetypal object. And then what also means to then like destroy that object by like through collage of like cutting and doing things to the surface of it. And then I guess I can also just mention something, because I didn't talk about my process very much in that little talk, but I also apply graphite to the surface of the collages and images, which is actually quite reflective. It's a little hard to document, but that also just circling back to using an earth material, right, towards within my process, and kind of bringing in a sort of like mark making, which I was thinking a lot about as Cleo was talking about the trees, like the mark making of in the inside of a tree. Yeah.
I might want to just add or another question to Cleo. You've become a mother, and how did that change your approach to art making or the kind of pieces you would be making, other than having less time, obviously? But did you feel another kind of change in your process in art making?
Oh yeah. Let me see how I can distill that answer down, because it's something I think and talk about a lot. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two primary things beyond the kind of, like you mentioned, like the logistics part,
Right.
which is one, it completely changed my confidence and my relationship to my like creative source. I'm not sure how much for me that has to do with motherhood or has to do with like post-traumatic growth. I had postpartum depression for the first year of my first kid's life, and it completely decimated my confidence on every level, which, as any creative person knows, like lack of confidence is the enemy of creativity, right? Because you kind of kill every idea before it can even grow. But then oddly, when I came out of that year and my confidence came back, it came back stronger than ever before. And so I've enjoyed 5.5 years now of like just not giving a fuck. And it's been great. And I've been way more creatively productive despite not having time. And it's not just about confidence, it's kind of about feeling like plugged into my source, like feeling like rather than circling around the thing I care about or the thing I mean, which I think I did for many years, I just feel like, yeah, I just feel connected. And the work can happen much more intuitively. And I go through phases of kind of questioning it and theorizing it and writing about it, but I try really hard to not do that at the same time that I'm making it. So that's a big way, that confidence shift. And then the other thing I would say that has changed is just really an embracing of chaos. And as I mentioned in my work, I've always been interested in like the flaws, the imperfections, kind of highlighting that. But it's one thing to embrace that as like an aesthetic versus to embrace it as a lifestyle. And I really struggle with embracing it as a lifestyle. And I have had to, because that's, you know, like my house is total chaos all the time. And it's really like forced me to not be a perfectionist, which I think then kind of is connected back to the confidence issue. I think particularly a lot of women, myself included, suffer from perfectionism, and it holds us back creatively. And so that's been something I've really pushed against. And having kids was like the final, like it just pushed me over the edge and was like, okay, nothing is gonna be the way you wanted it to be. And so embrace what's happening. And I'm not saying I'm good at it, but it's there. I think about the ideology of good enough really a lot. And not just to my parenting or my, you know, house or whatever, but also to the artwork, that like sometimes what you're trying to say, it's time to push it out of the nest and it's good enough and you can make the next thing even better. But if you wait forever and constantly pick at it, it won't ever go anywhere, you know, it won't happen. So yeah. chaos, embracing chaos.
Thank you. Dionne, does this issue of confidence does that play into your work? I mean, survival methods and being able to orient yourself, is that playing with the sense of confidence?
I can definitely relate to it from like a creative process, like as I'm like literally being in the studio or just having ideas and like, yeah, not trying not to shoot them down right away, trying to like see them through. But I've grown a lot too recently, actually, just thinking about, you know, just it's all fine. Like it's just like it's all gonna be fine. It's like it's okay. It doesn't have to be this like, you know, life or death situation around every decision that's made. But in terms of like how it folds into my thinking around survival skills and whatnot, I would actually say no, because it's more for me, the way I think about it, it's a little bit more complex, like something that I didn't mention today, but I usually do is just talking about you know, this pandemic happening and kind of this at the same time as a racial reckoning and at the same time as like being here like wildfire season and just really considering like who is best positioned to survive, which I don't think necessarily has much to do with like how confident you feel, because we also know that there are, you know, historical systems and contemporary systems that are set up to ensure survival of others and not of and not in the not the survival of other people. So I don't know. That's the angle I'm always thinking it through.
Thank you. Well, I think we are about out of time, and I would just like to thank Clea and Dion really heartfully for being here and sharing your work. Really impressive and heartfelt work, and I hope that we will soon meet in real space. And wish you all the best. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Thank you.